Thank you very much for that generous and humbling introduction and for the invitation to speak here today. Before lunch, it's always good to go on before lunch when the blood sugars are not low and everyone's looking for a feed and staying awake. But I plan to talk for about 15 and then hopefully take some questions. But before I do that, I'm a bit uncomfortable with the title of this presentation. I really don't think it is the job of the media to sell anything to the public. It is our job and responsibility to, as Chris Masters so ably said, report the facts to the best of our ability and to occasionally offer observations based on those facts. Some important principles apply here, and these thoughtful quotes that I picked up from a paper entitled "Herding Cats, the Evolution of the ADF's Media Embedding Program in Operational Areas," written by a former Defence Public Affairs Officer, Lieutenant Colonel Jason Logue, make the point. I recommend this document to you, and on the strict understanding that embedding is not the only method of engagement. The first quote: "Military professionals ought to seek the truth, no matter how awkward or uncomfortable it is, and support the media in reporting that truth. If the truth is unfavourable, then we should not be surprised by the unfavourable response of the public to such reports. If your soldiers are poorly disciplined, racist, or misogynistic, then this truth will be revealed sooner or later. It's all fairly simple. Work on getting real things right. Invite the media in to see it and let them report what they see." That's from Lieutenant Colonel Chris Smith, CO of MTF-3. The next quote: "Put simply, war is sustained through public support, which in turn is enabled through regular and consistent contact with the media. It is simply unreasonable to not engage, because to not do so will damage the campaign. I believe the Army and ADF must focus on providing an opportunity for the campaign to be fairly reported, and the enhancement to the Media Embed program provide a great opportunity to do this," said Major General Angus Campbell, CO Task Force 633 and now Chief of Army. Finally, neither government ministers nor military officers should expect the heirs to CEW Bean to consider it their job to make us comfortable. Their responsibility to hold us to account, to tell the truth, to expose lies, is an indispensable safeguard of the democratic contract between government and citizen. There have been times when governments have failed to recognise the importance of that safeguard or swept it aside as an inconvenience. There have been times also when journalists have not lived up to that responsibility, the heavy responsibility that rests on their shoulders. Senator John Faulkner, Minister for Defence, February 2010. Now, there appears to be furious agreement here from three different levels of the system. And I'm sure if you spoke to a game digger or warrant officer, you'd get a similar view, perhaps a little bit more bluntly put. But I support all three perspectives, and as someone who has reported on every conflict involving Australian forces, or most of conflicts involving the Australian forces since '93, I feel qualified to offer some further comments. Firstly, on the subject of embedding, I must say that while it is a much more useful tool than not embedding, it must be treated as a truly immersive experience and not simply a PR exercise whereby meaningless story ideas, and Chris mentioned the Trade Training Centre in Tarancot, are thrust upon journalists who are at the mercy of ADF public affairs officers, or indeed recalcitrant commanding officers, for their welfare and security. Non-embedded reporting offers a completely different take on a conflict, and I'm sure that during Operation Shock and Awe in 2003, senior officers in Canberra took great interest in reports filed by myself and the other Australian reporter who endured the bombing campaign to report from the Iraqi side of the war and to give eyewitness accounts from Baghdad. When I began writing about the military, more years ago than I care to remember, I had the unique pleasure to engage with a true ADF character in Brigadier Adrienne DJ, MC. I hear some chuckles in the audience. Daj is a notorious figure who will be known to many of you either directly or by reputation. At the time, he was Director General of Military Public Affairs. As such, he had the ear of the Defence Minister, the CDF, the service chiefs, and he was therefore at the beating heart of the organisation. He and his superiors genuinely understood the democratic contract between government and citizen, quote unquote. Now, Daj came to the job knowing nothing about the media, like many of his successors, but he quickly got the hang of it. During his tenure, the relationship between the media and defence was the best it ever was in my 24 years or so of covering the round. His methods and his capacity for strong drink would be regarded these days as slightly unreconstructed. But my point is that Daj knew what was going on, was fearless, had the trust of the establishment, had a good personal relationship with reporters, most importantly, covering the defence beat. And even when you had a hugely negative story, and I had quite a few of those, he was able to confirm it, plead for some mercy, and always standing by for a debrief over a beer. Now that's a crucial point that is lost on many of his successors. Since then, numerous models have been tried, dozens of military and civilian officers have been rotated through, most having never met a journalist, and things have never been as productive for either side. I cannot recall a single phone call from a DGPA between 96 and 2015 suggesting a heart-to-heart over a lunch or a beer. I ceased covering defence last December when I left full-time journalism to concentrate more on becoming a struggling author. And I can hand on heart say that the relationship between the media and the military is as bad as ever. Now, one of the reasons for this poor state of affairs, as Chris alluded to, is the inevitable churn in both military and media careers. And of course, you know, the DGPA or the media staff have their career paths and they don't often hang around for long, the same as journalists don't often hang around covering around for long. I was very fortunate that my organisation allowed me to stay in the game for a long time. So fault lies on both sides. But as a long hauler, if you like, I believe that despite several well-intentioned attempts to build bridges between the two, the chasm remains as deep and as wide as ever. And it's fair to say that the job has become more complex in recent times because military deployments themselves have grown in complexity and risk. But given that there are strong and professional relationships forged between British and American forces and their media outlets, and I've seen this up close and personal, the hostility between our two sides appears to be a uniquely Australian problem. The Brits and the Americans somehow accept that reporters will report, warts and all. Our military doesn't seem to be able to do that. Now, I know that ADF personnel are taught to distrust, despise, perhaps even fear the media, but I am sure that Lieutenant Colonel Smith was correct when he said military professionals ought to seek the truth, no matter how awkward or uncomfortable it is, and support the media in reporting that truth. Unfortunately, such support has been rare, and the tendency is to hide, cover up or censor rather than to assist the media in reporting the truth. When the cover-up or the stuff-up is exposed, some generals have even gone as far as trying to pressure top management to rein in the offending journalists. Now, I can tell you from personal experience that that is not a very good way to go, and that often will even result in a pay rise for the journalist. Of course, covering up is impossible when reporters are embedded on operations, properly embedded. Apart from the obvious operational security restrictions, and I fully agree with Chris on that point. I don't know any journalist who ever wants to get an Australian or any other soldier killed, but I do know plenty who don't know much and therefore need some guidance on those issues of operational security. But when they're embedded, reporters are free to report what they see. In simple terms, if what they see is a digger helping a local child and being professional, then they report that and all is well and the mission is apparently sold. If, on the other hand, they see a soldier roughing up a local kid or being unprofessional, they report that and the media is bad and the mission is not sold. In my experience, covering numerous operations in those years that I mentioned. The performance of Australian troops in places as diverse as Somalia, Cambodia, East Timor, Iraq and Afghanistan was overwhelmingly positive. Like Chris, I found the Australians to always be that cut above others when it comes to dealing with local people and having a cultural exchange. They've always been more impressive than their coalition comrades, especially the Americans, who tend to operate in a tight group and kill everyone. It was always a pleasure to join diggers on patrol and to observe their professionalism up close and personal, and to tell their stories. And even if those stories were not positive, it was always a pleasure to be out in the field with the soldiers, sleeping, living, eating, yarning with them, and being told even on occasions that if those idiot Afghans start shooting, knock them out. We didn't report that. So why the reluctance to allow reporters into the fold? Almost to a person, every Defence Minister, CDF that I have met has come into the job pledging to improve relations between the military and the media, or at least offering not to make it worse. Apart from a few notable exceptions, and I don't want to name any exceptions, but there are one or two, virtually everyone has failed. Of course, this institutional secrecy is not uniquely a defence problem. It appears to infect the whole of government in Australia, as we have seen recently with border protection. 13 years ago in the Solomon Islands, at the start of the Ramsey operation, or the invasion of Honiara as I call it, DFAT was the lead agency. Now, I thought it'd be a great story to go down to Red Beach, that famous beach in Honiara from the Guadalcanal campaign of World War II, and do a story on the Aussies setting up their tents on Red Beach and getting this mission underway, and just a really good picture story. So I went to the gate and the soldier said, no, you can't come in, and you have to go and see the DFAT person who's staying at the hotel up in town. So, okay, we went up to town, knocked on the door. The DFAT person, who will remain nameless, a woman, opened the door in her Manola Blahniks and her very nice outfit, and said, no, you can't do a story like that. So I said, okay, fine. I went down to the beach. I got a banana boat for $50, and he took my photographer and I down the coast, and we did an amphibious assault on Red Beach. And the first thing we met on Red Beach were a couple of young soldiers walking down the beach with their engagement cards that the government that they're given. We are here to help our brothers in the Solomon Islands doing a completely ridiculous thing. But they gave, I had a read of it and wrote it all down. Just about to get back on my banana boat to go back to town to file the story, and the Defence PR bloke comes running up the beach, puffing and huffing. What are you doing? I said, I'm just getting on my boat to go back to town to file my story. And he said, oh, you didn't get permission? I said, no, I didn't get permission. This is, I don't need permission to come here. This is sovereign Solomon Islands territory. And I got back on the boat, went back to town, and it's a front page story the next day about the Australians, and there was a little bit of embarrassment about the rules of engagement card. Now, had they let me in the gate in the first place, I would never have seen the rules of engagement card, this ridiculous thing. I wouldn't have been able to write about it. It wouldn't have been such a big story. It would have been a positive story, and all would have been well. I just use that as an illustration of the point. Sometimes it's better to cooperate. So, in my view, selling the mission to the people, if that is indeed the objective, is a simple matter. It means trusting military professionals who are trained at taxpayer expense to tell their stories to journalists, who are willing to put their lives and creature comforts on the line, and who are usually fairly well trained to bear witness. For the head shed over at Russell, that means taking a deep breath, standing back, and watching the mutual respect grow and prosper. Of course, they are dealing with human beings, so they will cop a few hits along the way, and should bear in mind the words of Friedrich Nietzsche, that which does not kill us makes us stronger. Thank you very much.
Chris, your questions, please. John Blackson.
Ian and Chris, thank you very much for excellent presentations. I'm struck by the phenomenon of that you describe, and I wonder if you could comment on two aspects that I think may well be instrumental in this constrained environment that contrasts so sharply with Adrienne DJ's time. We have, you both have spent a lot of time considerable time in the Middle East, monitoring Australia's niche calibrated contributions that are really primarily about alliance management, not doing that much on the ground. My sense is that one of the reasons why you've been so constrained is because we haven't been all that wanting to be transparent about how little we're actually doing on the ground. And secondly, the military cops a bad rap for being hostile to the media, and yet my sense is a lot of that hostility is actually driven by the politicians, the defence ministers, and we've had a couple of doozies who have been draconian in their approach to allowing the military to speak with an open mind. And I wonder if you could comment on those 2 points, please.
Do you want me to go? Well, I think I take your point on the Middle East issue. I think that's right. But you see, most of the heavy lifting and the hard work's been done by Special Forces, and of course we don't get access very readily to Special Forces on operations. Chris's doco was an exception within the constraints that they applied to him. Of course, you can't go out on an SAS patrol if you're a middle-aged hack like me who's unfit and likely to, hold up the patrol and get, be a pain in the neck. And also, it's, there are tactics, techniques and procedures that they guard very closely, and we understand and accept all of that. On the question of the ministers and so on, any Minister for Defence who says to a CDF, I want to restrict the media's coverage of defence, will not get an argument from a CDF. I've known a lot of CDFs who have had a very hostile attitude to the media, to the point of manic hostility. Now, whether they've been earlier in their careers somehow burnt, or some media person's done something terrible to them, or I don't know. But at the end of the day, I think there's fault on both sides of that fence, John, and I take your point. Some ministers are very reluctant to get engaged. Others are quite good, like John Faulkner and Brendan Nelson to name two. But I think CDFs fundamentally, and Mark Binskin I think is an exception, and probably prior to him, you're looking at Angus Houston was reasonably receptive, but others are very hostile. Chris.
I think we miss Adrienne DJ for being that person who will appear and will answer the questions. I mean, have you seen a person like that since? That spokesperson, and frequently they just refuse to comment, and that always makes it look worse. And I don't understand why that's so, because context is important. Yes, I know the ministers are part of that last important chain that I'm talking about, but it's not just them. I mean, most of you wouldn't know how pissed off we get when we cannot get anybody to answer our emails or phone calls. I mean, why is that so? Why would it take weeks and weeks for somebody to simply do their job? Now, I imagine that the problem is that we are dealing with captains and majors whose careers depend on it, and I've got so angry with them on occasions, I've finally realised that it wasn't their fault. That they were simply, they just found it easier not to respond to my request. By the way, we can waste a fortune. You go off to do a series of interviews, you've spent a fair bit of money getting to a place, you finally get there and you're told that they tell you that permission's been withdrawn. And like Ian alluded to, so much of it is counterproductive. I can tell you in investigative journalism, when that's happened to me, when I've got here to Canberra, expecting to do a series of interviews, already booked the hotel for 3 or 4 days, and nobody turns up, I'm a friend, by the way. People know that I'm a friend of the ADF, and I go out of my way to understand the ADF's position. But this is how I get treated. So You know, I wonder how you treat your enemies.
Adding to that, it's a funny story. When we arrived in Bagram in 2002, about August I think it was, a bunch of journos went there to do the first trip to Afghanistan to see what the Special Operations Task Group was up to. But we landed in Bagram after 24 hours travelling on an Ilyushin, a Ukrainian Ilyushin aeroplane, and then a C-130, up to there, and the ramp went down, and we all walked off the back of the ramp. I remember Gus Gilmore was with us, and Tony Park, who you mentioned, the author now, was the PR bloke, big lanky fellow, a nice bloke, Tony, came marching up to the bottom of the ramp and said, "There are no SAS here," to half a dozen journos who'd just spent 36 hours getting to Afghanistan to do a story about the SAS. So it didn't start well. It ended better.
I went to Perth to do a series of interviews with the SAS, and did all the right things, sent the list, all that. When I got there, anybody who was serving, all of a sudden I was told anybody who was serving was unavailable. This is where it gets counterproductive. What happened then? I have to ring them up and say, "I'm sorry, this interview that we planned to do, we can't now do because your boss says I'm not allowed to do it." Within a week, my phone's ringing off the hook because that informal internal network here, that they've been disallowed from talking to me, so they chase me down. This is a fundamental principle of investigative journalism. As soon as a barrier is put up, somebody says, "Well, what's behind it?" And you keep looking, and inevitably, as you said, you find what you didn't set out to look for in the first place.
Mark O'Neill.
Good afternoon, gentlemen, and thank you for that insight about all the things that we've been doing wrong. I'd like to know more, and noting probably a concern if you look at the media coverage, perhaps not a lot of Special Forces involved in this, and I go to your point about what's news. How can we as the ADF, given the content of this conference and the acknowledged importance from both sides of the political spectrum we've heard over the last 2 days, of the Indigenous capability stuff that doesn't have images of SOTGs jumping around doing exciting stuff, how can we best show this and make it, for want of a better word, newsworthy? It is important, but is it newsworthy? And how do we seek to engage and convey that message?
I think it is newsworthy. I think it is important, and as I said in my piece, it's a matter of aligning that left and right of arc. I like that expression you use, and I often think that if we really want to work, if we want to have a creative partnership, you've got to find the right people who are interested in that story and have the right kind of program that can tell that story. And that, there are people who will do that.
Yeah, I think the key is access. I think any journo worth their salt, if they march out the gate of a forward operating base or a patrol base in Afghanistan with a bunch of diggers, they will find a story. The story is just there. That's why covering the defence beat, and I wouldn't like this spread around, is really one of the best beats going, because you just have to turn up. It's like being in Baghdad in 2003 when the shock and awe was on. You only had to wake up and open your eyes, and hopefully that happened every day. And then the story was there. It's like when you're on patrol with diggers in Afghanistan, the story is there. Whatever they're saying, how they're doing it, it's a fantastic story, and a story that people are interested in and journos are interested in. But when you've got film crews or journos sitting in the base at Tarankout drinking 4 gallons of green bean coffee a day because someone won't allow them to go out the front gate with the patrol that's going out, then it's a problem.
And question here, and Noel will be last. So this one, that'd be nice brief questions.
Don Deaconbell. Unlike the older type of journalist who knew their subject, and you two represent, many modern journalist school graduates will do a flower show one day and a defence story the next. How do you think we should engage with these types of people who don't know a commander, as in Bruce Kafer, from a Commodore, Bruce Kafer?
We're we're frequently punished for this, and I've made plenty of mistakes too. And look, I'd frankly like you to be a bit more forgiving and recognise it's very, very hard. And you know, we're not experts on everything. We should do our R&D. We should understand a lot better, but we can't understand it all. So I think the best way is to get the most possible help we can from the people around us and be part of that vetting process. I think when it comes to sort of institutional education, it often seems to me that more journalists ought to be coming to something like this, not just Ian and myself. That it wouldn't be a bad idea to invite journalists. They wouldn't have to be defence reporters either, to occasionally attend staff college, to occasionally go to Canungra, to open the door. I think from a PR standpoint, it would be a damn good idea. Every time I come to something like this, I think the public ought to know more about this.
And I think further to that, I think that's a great idea, but there also should be, you know, good quality background briefing and information. And when you turn up to a news conference with concerning Commodore Kafer, the commanding officer of ADFA, the journalist should be presented with a pack which explains the difference and the rank structure, and it's pretty simple stuff. The journos are pretty busy usually, and they're kind of like you say. Today they're doing a story on the Flower Show, tomorrow they're doing a story on ADFA or whatever. If they've got the information in their hand and they don't have to run around for an hour afterwards finding what's this Commodore mean? How's that compare to a commander? And they don't have to find that out. It's much, much better. And I think a good media organisation provides that context. And, you know, generally speaking, Defence does do that, but I think there is room for improvement on that score.
And last question.
Thank you very much. Insightful to see it from your side. I was the Deputy Commander in the Middle East, and for several Embed programs we tried desperately to make available access to the ship, our personnel, air task group, etc. And all too often we were told, yeah, that's great, but we want to go here and only here. We want to be on the ground with the diggers as compared to the ships, etc. So it was very hard for us to know what you wanted to be able to get what is newsworthy to you. And often that eluded our ability to try and sell stories that were important to the organisation and to make sure you were seeing the full range of activities that were there to hopefully do it. But from there, the question I'd have is, how do we rebuild a robust relationship between the media and senior defence? Clearly what we're doing now is not working. At every level we have space to move. How do we rebuild that relationship?
Well, I think in an ideal world you would have a person running the Defence Public Affairs organisation who was a person who was, you know, there for a while and was committed to doing it, you know, in a way that was meaningful for the media. I'm not talking about a Daesh type figure out on the terps with old blokes like me. I mean, that's not going to work these days because the young kids are not into that and they're all into, you know, social media. So they've got to be across all that other stuff as well. But I mean, a relationship whereby they do have the occasional, maybe, you know, get together for a nice kale salad or something, you know, whatever they do these days, you know, whatever they do these days. And I think the personal relationship building is really important. So, okay, up in the press gallery there's half a dozen guys and girls who cover this area. Occasionally they might be a good idea to have them over to some neutral ground and have a meal and a chat and, you know, get together and know each other. And here's my number, and if anything comes up, give me a call. And when you're going to the Middle East on an embed, let me know what you're interested in. And I know that there are extensive wish lists handed out to Defence, given to Defence on any of the embeds things that I was involved in. And usually, like the plans for a battle, right? The first thing to go is truth, then the plan. I think the personal thing, you can't really put too high a premium on that. It's really very, very important. But it's, in churn terms, not easy, I accept.
I think that there is a bit of an 80s model to the media management in Defence. It is sort of attuned to the old hometowner, to the idea of generating new recruits, and there isn't the connections from the editorial officers, you know, people at rank who matter don't have those relationships with our editors in the corner offices. And that's, you know, most other industries have relationships. It's a pity that they don't occur. And I think news sense is valuable and ought to be cultivated. When I talk about that last link in the chain, you know, the people at that level ought to do as you're trained to do, and, you know, get into the mind of the enemy and try to think the way we do. And when we meet your media officers on these embeds who have a bit of news sense, gee, it makes a world of difference. You know, like Jason Blaine studied communications, and I could see that. You know, I could see that Jason figured out the way I could think. I was amused when I did the SOTG embed that James Kidd, Billy the Kid, some of you would know, he worked me beautifully. And actually, I kind of enjoyed it. You know what I mean? Because he understood that what I wanted was a story. So he shaped the environment to give me a story that made me happy. The degree to which I was manipulated and controlled, I can't really say whether how comfortable or uncomfortable I am about that. But in the end, I admired him.
Look, it's been a wonderful extended forenoon. We're now going off to lunch, but before we do, please show our appreciation to